Buenas tardes. We're going to speak in Latin America, so we got to say buenas tardes, right? It's a pleasure. Thank you for coming, and thank you to all that are present in this very wonderful, important event with a great group of people that is going to speak to us today on the geopolitics of Latin America and the Caribbean. For me, as a visiting professor here at the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University, it's a great honor to be the host today and the moderator. And I'm very pleased to see some of my former students in the room. It's great, and such an interest of the community of Princeton and both academic and others visiting here today. Also, let me remind you that there's a lot of people connecting in streaming, so they can see it as we speak now, or they can really connect later. So again, it's a great pleasure. Let me get into our role today. We have this panel on geopolitics of Latin America and the Caribbean. As we know, Latin America and the Caribbean is this very special region that everybody calls the region of the future, because it has an incredible amount of natural resources, a great population that actually is relatively young. Average is 32 years old. And when we think about the potential of the region being close to North America, to the United States, where financial capital is available, where education and best universities in the world are available, you can see a great opportunity for the region. But as we speak, there are challenges. Populism, organized crime, and very weak institutions have made the region potential very difficult to achieve. And that has been said for decades, but now in front we have a more challenging scenario. For the first time in decades, we can openly say that we're in the middle of global power competition. And global power competition is happening, meaning that it's not only the powers in the north of the hemisphere looking to the region and engaging, but other powers from different regions of the world coming to the region, seeking for its potential opportunity or simply meddling in the competition against the other powers. That's a reality. In addition to that, the US policy is changing. We have a new administration starting from the month of January, and we're only here in April, but a lot has happened along that period. Too many events, too many things, too many speeches that include places like Greenland, that is in the hemisphere, that includes discussions with Canada and Mexico, that imply events in Panama or events in Colombia, and in other places in the region like Guyana, among others. Recently, the OAS elected its new Secretary General, the Organization of American States, and the person that was elected for the first time comes from a Caribbean country, Suriname, somehow changing the tradition in this institution of typically having a Spanish-speaking leader from one of the Latin American countries. All these I'm just putting in context to discuss and said what all this means for the region. Tariffs, what tariffs will imply. The potential of minerals and natural resources, how that would look like to the future. The consultation between regional powers like Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, to somehow oppose to whatever is in front in the United States or in a different stance with Europe. All this to say that there are other countries that appear to be maligned powers regionally, like Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, that are opposing democratic values and creating also a lot of noise for Latin America and the region. With that said, there's a lot to talk. And I think we are hoping today to get some lights about the present, but especially about the future. How Latin America can take advantage of these events. How can the region move forward to a better future? And how all these can be done in a concerted strategy, actually hemispheric, hopefully uniting one day from Canada to Argentina. As hard as it looks, how that discussion can happen. With that, let me introduce our panelists today. We're very fortunate to have such level of leaders today. We are very fortunate to have people that was willing to come to Princeton despite their very busy agendas, but more important than that, with an incredible background and incredible knowledge for a day like today. Let me start to introduce Olivia White. Olivia is a senior partner at McKinsey & Company and is the director of the McKinsey Global Institute. She advises leading financial institutions on strategy, risk, resilience, while also supporting global economic development initiatives. Her research focuses on resilience, financial markets, technology, and inclusive growth. Before McKinsey, Olivia was a fellow at MIT, conducted research in physics and neuroscience. She holds a PhD in physics from Harvard University and a master in math from Oxford as Rhodes Scholar. Very recently, Olivia and her team published a report on global geopolitics, on resources, technology, and the future of geopolitics. Then we have Dan Erikson, great friend. Dan is a senior expert in US foreign policy. He's the former special assistant to the President Biden and senior director for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the National Security Council in Washington. He previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the region, overseeing US security policy for 34 nations. Dan also advised two US vice presidents on foreign policy and held senior roles at the State Department. He also is recipient of the State Department's Superior Honor Award, and he holds degrees from Harvard Kennedy School and Brown University, and he's Fulbright Scholar and Council on Foreign Relations member. Finally, I'm going to introduce Juan Cruz, who is coming in the train, so we'll see him in a few minutes. Juan is a senior advisor at Dynamic Americas, consulting firm for Latin America, and a non-resident senior advisor at the CSIS, specializing in national security and hemispheric politics, geopolitics. He previously served as senior special assistant for the US President for Hemispheric Affairs, 2017 to 2019. That means President Trump first term, leading regional strategy and policy on Venezuela and Cuba. With over 30 years in government, he held senior intelligence and diplomatic roles across Latin America, combating transnational threats. He's fluent in Spanish, Portuguese, and he holds degrees from Georgetown and Johns Hopkins and Northwestern. With that, what I will ask is each of our panelists to come here and give us 5 to 7 minutes thoughts, ideas, and then we're going to have a conversation among us in front of you. By the end, I hope you can be having or including some questions. Thank you so much. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here. And I'm going to do my best. I'm going to start with some context. And I don't know that my context will be fully up to date, but I'll do my best to be, up to date through about yesterday at noon. That was supposed to be a little bit of a joke, but no. But like broader, so I'm going to actually focus on setting the stage associated with trading patterns, productivity, and demographics in Latin America. And we'll talk more about the implications for geopolitics during the panel and as others give their remarks. Let me actually start with connection and a comment about the world at large. So if you look at the world at large, every single region in the world is dependent on another region for at least 25% of its consumption, for the provision of its consumption of at least one important resource or manufactured good. So for example, Europe, Asia, China are extraordinarily dependent on other parts of the world for inputs in agriculture, in minerals not processed, in energy. And then many other parts of the world, Latin America included, are very, very dependent on other regions for manufactured goods. And that is a sort of grounding of just how entwined we are as a world right now. And that's an important sort of boundary condition. Now, when you look at Latin America, if you take a snapshot of Latin America in 2000 and you say, well, what were Latin America's interdependencies with the rest of the world? Who was its biggest trading partner? For every single country in Latin America, save for Cuba, the US was the largest extra-regional trading partner. If you fast forward to about today, this actually the crossover point would have been in about 2020, everywhere in South America, that largest extra-regional trading partner had become China, largely driven by export of resources, not entirely, also increased imports of manufactured goods. And most of Central America, where with Central America I'm including Colombia, US was still the largest extra-regional trading partner. Part of what that means then, if you think about where we are in at least the announced tariff regime, is that Latin America had less, as a rule, less of a trade deficit with the US. So with the announced tariffs, and then Mexico, at least for now, was exempted from the calculation that was announced on the 2nd of April. So at least for now, Latin America is in a place where it is, under announced tariff rates, significantly less highly tariffed than many other regions in the world, and in particular Asia. And so, for example, just as one example, if you look at a manufactured good, it's not sophisticated manufactured good, but a manufactured good like textiles, and you look at a sort of cost curve and you say, well, who's least tariffed? By far, producers in Central America. So just sort of remember this as we go. Now, when you look at more sophisticated manufactured goods, there is, save for the signs of, for example, increase in auto manufacture in Brazil, there's less of that happening everywhere in Latin America today, except for Mexico, and that's a different situation. So that's one sort of lay of the land. Let me say another thing, though, as I think about Latin American workforce, and the Latin American workforce that might step up as manufacturers, right, to help support development of industry in Latin America. So as Juan Carlos said, Latin America is young today. It will not always remain young. And in fact, if you look at the demographic distribution right now, one can predict that ranging from about right now to 2040 to 2050 for places like Honduras and El Salvador and Guatemala, you're going to start getting a downturn in the fraction of people of working age, so typically measured as 15 to 65, versus the rest of the population. In other words, the demographic bonus is coming to an end. And that's the sort of thing that's difficult to erase quickly, because babies born today aren't going to start working productively until 20 to 30 years into the future. So to some degree, Latin America broadly is a little bit in a race against that clock. How to become more productive, hopefully in a more interconnected world, perhaps, right? How to become more productive when there are not as many people who can actually be producing. So each individual labor productivity has to go up. And just to give you a sense of these numbers, because these are actually quite stark, all of this is largely driven by fertility rates. In Chile, lowest fertility rate in Latin America, fertility rate, so number of kids that the average woman has in her lifetime, is measured at 1.17. 2.1 is about replacement, where a couple will replace themselves effectively. And just about everywhere else in the region is also below that level. So there's a real race against the clock, given where we stand right now. Let me turn to productivity and productivity growth, and then I hope that sets some of the economic stage for the rest of what we're talking about. Latin America over the past 25 years was a rather of an exception across the world in the degree to which its productivity actually was growing, right? So bad news, at least so far, versus fertility. Productivity growth was about 0.6% per year in Latin America. It's about 0.5% per year in Western Europe, so ahead of Western Europe. It was about 8% per year in China. And in places like Eastern Europe, Central Europe, places that really shot ahead over the period, it was between 2 and 3.54%. And so there's this real imperative to figure out how to take this land of tremendous richness, but this place that has this real imperative, given its demographics, to figure out how to shift in a world where geopolitical ties are sort of tricky, to say the least. And, you know, as Juan Carlos said, you can think about Latin America as the land of the future, but you also want to make sure that it is not always the land of the future. And so with that, maybe I'll pass it over to Dan, and then we can talk. Hopefully this will feed into some of the context relevant for geopolitics.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that laydown, Olivia. Thank you, Juan Carlos, for the invitation. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. I've had the opportunity to visit Princeton before. It's my first time speaking here, and really appreciate everyone's attention. As Juan Carlos mentioned in the introduction, I spent the last year of my life until a couple of months ago as the Senior Director for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the National Security Council. And when you have one of these national security jobs, it's a full-time occupation. You don't get to get out too much and pick up popular culture. So I spent the last month or two catching up with some movies and had a chance to see A Complete Unknown. And so I wanted to start with a Bob Dylan quote, that the times, they are a-changing. And I think that what we have right now is a period in Latin America and the Caribbean where you have countries that are under enormous pressure, political pressure, economic pressure, demographic pressure, as was just spoken to. And there's a fundamental need for democracies to deliver. And that is the central challenge that faces all of the leaders in this region. One of the decisions that they are each taking individually and collectively is, can they deliver for their populations more effectively together or acting independently? In the near future, at the end of this year, we'll have an opportunity to evaluate the state of inter-American relations because there will be a Summit of the Americas. This is a once every 3-year multilateral gathering. This year will take place in the Dominican Republic. And these meetings always represent an inflection point of the state of the hemisphere and the relationship among the different countries. The one that was held a couple of years ago during the Biden administration in Los Angeles was beset beforehand with a number of controversies and challenges, although it yielded to a relatively successful meeting. But topics like migration, immigration policy, economic development, climate were all very much top of mind. And so I think as we see this agenda come together towards the end of this year, that'll also offer an opportunity to see where we're headed. In the introductory remarks by Juan Carlos, several of the themes that are outlined that are real challenges in Latin America today. Would sometimes refer to them as the 4 C's. They include China, crime, corruption, and also climate. And those are issues that every country is reckoning with in its own way. While, of course, the role of China in Latin America is very much in the news, so much in the news, it can feel like a new topic. In fact, it's been about a quarter century since the former Chinese Premier Jiang Zemin made his big tour through Latin America in the 2000s was China was really a very, very small trading partner of most of the countries at that time. And what you've seen over time is that Chinese trade and investment has picked up dramatically and also has forced many countries in the region to have to make a choice in terms of how much they wish to engage with China or throw their lot with China vis-a-vis the United States. And you really see, I think, the difference too, the further south you get. Most of the countries in South America, with the exception of Colombia and a few others, have China as their major trading partner. Whereas from Panama North, Central America, Caribbean, Mexico, the economic linkages are much closer with the United States. And so when you think of today's geopolitics and where Latin America fits in, there's opportunities for real advancement and real progress in some areas, but also a number of areas where there's very deep and lingering challenges that have to be met. And a lot of this has to do with countries needing to focus on their own economic competitiveness and ensuring that their populations have a level of education, a level of entrepreneurship that enables them to compete in today's societies. At the same time, it's always just important to point out when you talk about Latin America and the Caribbean, it's easy to kind of group the countries together and treat them as a block. But in fact, there's 33 countries in this region. They go from the big behemoths, the large developing powers like Brazil, or certainly our near neighbor Mexico, to the smaller states of Central America, to some of the tiny, almost microstates in the Caribbean. And so it's very hard to come up with a one-size-fits-all or cookie-cutter approach to the problems in the region. Now, the Trump administration has come in and quickly reset at least the terms of the debate with a number of different countries. The tariff policies were alluded to. And as we know, they've been kind of shaped and reshaped over the past week, but also it seems like from what we're hearing from administration officials, possibly further tweaks forthcoming. On the one hand, the imposition of the new tariffs poses some real risks for Latin America and the Caribbean. On the other hand, a lot of these countries look at the rates, essentially it was 10% across the board, and to some degree they dodged a worst case scenario. There's other parts of the world that received much higher tariff rates. And also in Latin America, there's a number of exemptions that are made available so that energy and some natural minerals are not really affected. One thing that's really going to be needed now and moving forward is just a clear sense of leadership coming from the region. And there's been a trend over the last several years, which was really exacerbated, I think, by the COVID pandemic and the near-term aftermath, where countries became much more internally focused on their own health challenges, their economic challenges, less of a sense of working together, and even certain key partners in the region have always been a little bit off cycle. It seems like in the last couple of years, Brazil and Argentina have never quite been able to have governments that were ideologically in sync at the same time. When one country swings a little bit more to the conservative end of the spectrum, the other one goes to the progressive end and back and forth. And so whether they can focus on their real kind of core objectives and how to advance them is going to be a really critical question moving forward. And then I think, just to conclude the opening remarks, there's real questions that are going to have to be dealt with in the very near term that have to do with how Latin American countries are reshaping how they fit into today's geopolitics, what's their relationship to the multilateral institutions. As referenced, there's a new Secretary General of the Organization of American States. Soon there will be a new Secretary General of the United Nations. Theoretically, it's Latin America's turn to pick up that post, and so how that shapes up will be extremely important. Obviously, the relationship with the United States and seeing how that is impacted by some of the new policies that are coming out of the U.S. During this period, and then the fundamental fight against transnational organized crime and against corruption, which we can discuss more in the conversation. So I will conclude my opening remarks there. I'm pleased to welcome Juan Cruz to the podium, and we'll let the conversation continue. Thank you.
I'm introduced? Oh my God, I don't even know what that means. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to Ambassador Pinzon and Princeton and the fine team that enabled me to get here and to navigate Amtrak's trials and tribulations. And really excited to be here with Dana and Olivia and hopefully say something that you can take away, can be helpful. I thought I'd jump in these preliminary comments with just starting off with, I accompanied President Trump in the first 18 months of his first administration and helped shape his policy in Latin America. Same job Dan had with President Biden, I had with President Trump. And that means you're responsible for, Latin America, Caribbean, and you throw in Canada as well. And to be frank with you, I've been not surprised at all of many of the things that have happened and have spent the last almost year kind of trying to prepare people to understand where he's come from on these issues. And what I would suggest, and it's often difficult, especially in an academic setting, is to suspend disbelief. And if you do that and you embrace that almost anything's possible, I think it'd be a lot easier to understand what's taking place, and especially vis-a-vis the region. And why not jump in first with the issue of tariffs? And what I'd like to say there is, of course, that we look at it, and what they've chosen to do in this administration is, in essence, to weaponize tariffs. And so you can be a subject of tariffs, whether it's to punish or to coerce or to convince or to change behavior. And in these tariffs, it could be because we want to, in the administration, to lessen the trafficking of fentanyl or of people or of migratory issues and so forth. But I guess the best part to understand the weaponization of tariffs is really reflective of the subject that we're speaking about today, which is about the sort of geopolitics of the region. Because in essence, to best understand where Trump is coming from, you have to understand he's actually taking a page of the playbook of his adversaries. And if you think of how Russia, China, and Iran, for example, do business, it's quite different than how the US traditionally has conducted foreign policy. When we discuss things about commerce, we use commercial tools. And we discuss things in the world of diplomacy, we use diplomatic tools and so on and so forth. But in a Trumpian world, that seems silly. And so if you have advantages in the world of commerce, you use diplomatic tools. And you use military tools, and you use, if you're a superpower, you behave like a superpower and use the tools of being a superpower. It's reflective of his background as a businessman, which means that no businessman voluntarily gives up advantages. That would be silly. So why would you give up advantages as a nation like the United States? And therefore, what you see is when you are conducting, for example, commercial business, you open up that toolbox, and today you might talk about visa restrictions. That's highly uncharacteristic of the way that the United States has historically conducted business. But it's a new day, suspend disbelief. Then I would kind of, to set the framework for the discussion, I would talk about two other areas to take into account. And Dan discussed, I caught the tail end of his conversation here, and I would ask you to place that in the context of the following, which is, I would offer that there's no longer a policy towards Latin America, or a policy, or Brazil policy, or a policy towards Mexico and Colombia. It just doesn't work that way. What you have today are interests, and his interests are defined primarily by the number one issue that he campaigned on, the number one issue that the voters went out to vote for him on, and that we saw reflected in the polls. It's migration, the migratory crisis. And so if you want to define what's going to lead the foreign policy issues in the region, think in this bundle. It's going to be migratory, it's going to be security, which includes counter-narcotics, and thirdly, it's going to be China. And China's a big basket. It includes things like, commerce, and, this term has fallen out of use in this administration, but nearshoring and those sorts of things. That big bundle of critical minerals and everything else, because ultimately it's it's a challenge with China. So when you're looking to see what your role is and how you fit under the U.S. foreign policy interest in the region, you've got to define yourself against one of those three areas. That's how you determine relevance. And then thirdly, and lastly, I would say is you have to understand the foreign policy principles that drive the Trump administration. And they fall in four categories. The primary one being America first. Now we use that and throw it around so often that we forget what it actually means. It's what is in America's best interest. So if you put forward something that's really of interest to you, and you can't define it in the way that you can define it for America's best interest, then we're not going to do it. And secondly, you have to think of in terms of a transactional relationship. We wrapped our heads around this. It took us a while, the first administration, for the countries around the world to understand. I would argue that Latin America is one of the first regions that got it. They understand transactional natures, right? So it's a quick study. So what are you going to get for what you're discussing? Thirdly, is you're going to talk about what in the Trump world they call unilateral action. They don't exactly mean unilateral. What they mean is bilateral, and they definitely don't mean multilateral. So I would argue that places like the OAS and the UN are not places where anything is important is going to happen for the administration. Because if going back to the whole concept of being a superpower or being a business person, why would you take your advantages and all of a sudden throw those out the window to just be one more vote along with St. Lucia? It doesn't make sense, not in the Trumpian world. And so unilateralism also means, it means bilateral. We're not interested in discussing this with a group of countries. And then lastly, the term, and they use it in their own literature, is aggression, and I think we've seen that. Now aggression just, being aggressive in the US lexicon is not necessarily a negative thing. You want to be aggressive in business, you want to be aggressive in studies, and so on and so forth. And I think it encompasses the widest definition of that term. And maybe the last thing I'll end with is, I don't speak for the administration, I don't speak for the party, I don't speak for the consultancy I work for, and I don't speak for the think tank I work for. I'm just sharing my own comments. Thank you.
Muy bien, Juan. Thank you so much. Okay, appreciate it. So I think you have set the conversation very well. And that's my intent, really to have a conversation. So what I'll do is throw some questions to each of you, but all of you can feel free to, participate, add something that you feel you must. So let's start with that. I want to start with Olivia. You have put together this recent study in geopolitics, and you clearly have seen all these natural resources, technology, but you also spoke on aging, which is not a minor thing. Demographics are changing in the world, especially in some regions, and Latin America continues to be young, but not as young as it used to be. And when we speak in geopolitics, we typically think on trends for decades, a decade, 2 decades, etc. So the question for Olivia will be, what are the elements that can make Latin America a player in this global geopolitical shift that we're seeing? And how can we take advantage of that? What can be done?
So first, actually, just a comment on aging, because people talk about it being aging. The thing that's relevant is how many babies are being born. If you look at Brazil.
The mic?
Mike.
On the top.
Yeah. No, but you can't hear me?
I think it's on.
Yeah.
Just closer to me?
No,
Getting better? Okay.
Yep,
All
go
right.
for it.
So just a detour on aging. What really is important here is fertility and fertility rate, right? Like how many babies are being born. Comment on Brazil just as an example, and then shift to the more direct question, because I think it will then also tie to some really important things Juan said. So one measure that demographers and economists who look at demography will look at is the support ratio. For everybody over retirement age, how many younger people or working people are needed to support them? Or you can look at it in the reverse too. It's a dependency ratio. In 16 years, Brazil will have advanced economy level support ratios. So in 16 years, like the age balance in Brazil will look more like what it looks like on average in places in Europe. Yeah, is that better? Figure out, sorry. That's, in places like Europe and South Korea and China on average. So that just shows the degree to which we're actually coming quite quickly, at least in some major Latin American economies, to this point of sort of challenge. And so I would actually, and I talked a little earlier about the fact that economic productivity, labor productivity has been very, very sluggish. I might not get my numbers quite right, but in this spirit, okay, in 2000 or 1997, average labor productivity across Latin America was about $37,000 per year in today's dollars. It advanced only to $41,000 per year over a 25-year period. Super sluggish. And I think this ties very directly to some of the challenges that both the continent is, or the region is facing, and the sort of things that will be in the spotlight in unilateral or bilateral discussions, as Juan talked about. So like from a broader perspective, figuring out how to increase productivity, a little bit more on a second on how to think about doing that, is something that I think is actually both an internal economic imperative, but that will also put the region, at least over time, in a much stronger position vis-a-vis the things that at least the US administration right now is pushing for it to do. Now, how do you get there? Just a couple of thoughts. I mean, this is not an easy prescription, but a couple of thoughts. It is incredibly clear, looking at countries across the world, that investment and like good old capital investment, as well as some investment in intangibles, is an absolutely critical factor. You do not see anywhere in the world that has managed to grow its productivity meaningfully for which capital investment has not happened in meaningful ways. End of story, right? Education is important, healthcare is important, all of these things are important. Alone, they do not grow country level or regional level productivity. The other thing that's also very clear is that being strong as a resource provider generates a certain level of wealth. Nobody has managed to use it to drive overall economic growth over time in a broad-based way. And so you need prescriptions that go beyond that, even if one of your strengths is the ability to provide wealth, and potentially, actually, I want to put even if one of your strengths is the natural resources you have in a world that's focused more on green energy. So, I mean, I think that, but then all of this against the backdrop of the immediate discussion. But these things are completely imperative for the sort of economic future. And as I say, again, tied to some of the points, I think, of negotiation. Actually, let me add just one thing. The tie to China between Latin America is a tie that's very much grounded in the provision of natural resources. And that is the reason, as I mentioned and Dan mentioned, that is the reason that the trade of at least South America has shifted towards China, its provision of natural resources to China.
You want to add something, Dan, or one? Not on this one?
I agree with much of what Olivia said. I think that the core, if we're talking the economic side, I mean, the core piece is competitiveness. And how can this region become more competitive over time? And it has to do with levels of investment, with education, and really building the tools for education, building some social mobility so people can rise out of their income levels and move ahead. And this has frankly just been an issue that the region's struggled with for a long time. Every now and then there's a glimpse of a country that may have found a solution, like Chile for many years was viewed as the model until they had their own, I guess, crisis of confidence several years ago. And what we're seeing from some of the changes that Olivia mentioned, and also the shifts in U.S. policy that Juan discussed, is that if you're not competitive, no one's really going to step in to help you, right? And so it really needs to, whether they do it collectively as a unit or seek out their own comparative advantage, that's really what's going to get Latin America out of this slow growth trap that they've been in for many years. This year, some economists are slightly excited because the region's supposed to grow around 2.5%, which is up from last year. but nowhere near the kind of double-digit revolutionary growth that's required for these countries to really move to the next level.
So when I hear competitiveness, human capital, education, that's the prescription we need. How are we going to get it? That's a good question. And it's not an easy answer, but apparently some countries are starting to see China and others as the source to get infrastructure, to get technology, and even to think about education. What do you think about it? And this question, of course, goes for you then, and Juan, but definitely you too, Olivia. What do you think?
Want to take the first crack? Okay. So China has stepped in a few areas in a major way. Obviously, it's a big investor in natural resources. Also, has been investing more and more in infrastructure in Latin America. There's a massive port, for example, in Peru that opened last year, and as was stated, China is really a major purchaser of goods and natural resources that are coming from Latin America. On the educational side, China has begun to make some inroads in this space, but it isn't necessarily kind of the first resort for people from Latin America wishing to study overseas. But frankly, it could get more competitive in that area. And certainly if the United States shifts some of its policies to become less hospitable to international students. Another area where I worked for several years at the Pentagon, and one area I was always very concerned about China was professional military education, where the United States has historically had a very large advantage in the region based on a relatively modest investment in that area. But if China chose to step in that space, that's something as well. I talked about cyber a little bit before, but clearly China's engagement with telecommunication systems in the region is something that we need to watch out for. And so this is complex. The other piece, I don't want the conversation to go totally by without discussing Europe and the European Union, because collectively, the EU is a major investor in Latin America and the Caribbean, a big trading partner, and also a really important source of educational provision. And so I think there's also a role for Europe in this equation.
Juan, you want to add on this?
There's a lot to unpack on that question, and I agree with everything Dan said. If you take just a piece on education, for example, the proliferation at one point of the Confucius centers, and that countries like Brazil took a great advantage of that. And even in the US, we suffered that for a while until we were able to put it under control, because it becomes just an instrument for the Chinese to exercise all sorts of influence that goes just beyond the innocence of, studying Mandarin and having access to educational tools. And on the piece on military, I'd take the Chinese, I think, have done a particularly good job in the region, have supplanted a number of countries, not just us, I would say the Taiwanese and others, in that today in the region, if you're a military officer, want to distinguish yourself, something necessary to be able to advance and get promoted, there's something that quite easily to do that, which is foreign study. And so whether, you can end up in the NDU in some capacity or in any other US instrument of military study is one thing. But quite honestly, the Chinese have been very good at recruiting and providing these courses that quite often are not courses at all, but are an excuse to travel throughout China. And so you get this scholarship as a military officer in one of our countries in the region, and then you end up going to China, and you might have a day or two of study, but you have more days shopping and visiting military industrial complex and those sorts of things. And at the end of your experience, you get this, great photograph and a diploma that you take back home and you put among your personnel files that put you forward for promotion and distinguishes you from your classmates or from others in your rank. And by the way, you took home all sorts of things, and forget about the free phones and tablets you get from your visit to Huawei, but and all that implies in counterintelligence, but also new networks. I think one of the things we haven't been watching closely enough is all these graduates especially going now to not just military schools, but they end up in the long term being given to like interns and low-level people in, for example, in the Mexican Congress. And then eventually these people are going to be quite influential and important, and they're going to have a soft spot in their hearts for China. In the infrastructure, and without getting into too many details, for a long time we've complained that the Chinese are displacing the U.S. And Dan's heard me say this before, but when I was in the White House, I was trying to get my arms around this thing. What you find is that that's not what history shows. Yes, the Chinese are prevalent, and yes, the Chinese have displaced, but they didn't displace us. They ended up displacing, if you go backwards, probably Odebrecht, who was the Brazilian firm that has largely disappeared over corruption, widespread corruption scandals in the region. But when they were involved in a project, the project was great. And they did a lot of good things like corporate social responsibility, building wells and schools and everything, and winning over communities, something the Chinese don't do. But the Chinese spread a lot of money and incentivized corruption and that sort of thing in their own projects. But between the U.S. and Odebrecht, there are a lot of other people displaced. So that's just one of those notions. I think when we talk about geopolitics in the region, we tend often to overstate, and the true situation is bad enough that we don't need to bring the specters of what could be possible out there. And maybe I'll stop there.
I guess the only thing I'd add is, this question of one point on education, one point on sort of technology generally. Far be it from me to poo-poo education, and certainly, as Wooden was talking about education as a tool of influence and in the military realm, which is not at all my area of expertise. I think it is a mistake to focus on education as the initial key thing that's needed for economic growth. It's needed, but as I said, like, education alone simply doesn't do it, and there's nowhere in the world where you can point to the quality of human capital being the main driver. You just need investment, and you need an economy that starts to accommodate investment and then shifts in production in areas that drive productivity growth. So I just think that's actually really, really important. Now, linked to education, here's a fact about sort of Latin America at large. If you look at IP, intellectual property exports, Latin America is responsible for about 1% of the world's total intellectual property exports. It's responsible for about 8% of the world's intellectual property imports. Okay, so it has a ratio of 1 to 8. If you look instead at North America as an example, North America has a ratio of 4 to 1. It's reversed. Maybe not so surprising, but for Latin America, what it means is that Latin America is in this place of not being a producer of cutting-edge knowledge in the world, but rather an absorber. And you can look at that in two different kinds of ways. One is, oh my goodness, we need to figure out places to double down and maybe produce knowledge. Maybe, but that's a very hard putt. You can also look at it to say, we need to be absolutely top class at really putting to work the stuff that we import. And I would say, actually, that's where Latin America most likely does need to be, at least in the early term. So as you then start to think through education from a sort of economic point of view, part of it is broad-based so that everybody has a basic level, but maybe part of it is what's needed to take advantage of the investments tied to the cutting-edge stuff that does come in. So, and now, there are a whole bunch of geopolitical issues that come in there, because a lot of that's technology and data, et cetera, related, maybe some even militarily linked, but we can leave that for later.
That's a big thing, you put us in the whole perspective. Latin America has natural resources. We export those natural resources. Powers care about Latin America for natural resources, but the region itself is not really doing the job of creating knowledge, and because of that, creating an industrial, technological capability that allows to create wealth and better future. So it's a big statement. And as I said, and I would push a little bit, both Juan and Dan, to be more specific about why China is a good partner or a bad partner for Latin America. And I think we're getting to those era in which we need to think about that. But you can do it on your own. Let me throw, because I know you will come back on this, but let me throw it this way. In the past 3 months, a lot of things have happened, Juan. And you know that, you very well expressed. But I will say 3, at least to start. Greenland. Most of people doesn't understand why Greenland. I guess you do. Panama Canal. We have Secretary Hexeth, actually, as we speak, they're in Panama. And thirdly, tariffs. just to say just three small things that have, been discussed in the past 3 months that, are creating this whole geopolitical change. Not to say what happened to my country when they made the mistake of returning U.S. aircraft back, So those are the things that, are being just happened. So I'll start with one, but I'm sure, with the comments and others, you will come back with what I ask.
Okay, well, let's see. There's a lot. We could spend an entire day on this, and I'll try to, Greenland, it's actually all connected. And I know you're going to say, what? I heard it all, and the press came out and said that a lot of this clearly was improvised and that off the top of his head, and I can assert that that's not true. On the issue of Panama in particular, I probably had 3-4 conversations with him on it. Now, if I could distinguish a few things about Panama, is that more than anything else, he had a lot of facts of his own, which is not really characteristic of like how he would handle things. And it wasn't the kind of facts that someone just tossed a document on his desk, as happened in the first days of his administration, which, you're trying to figure out who put this in front of him. This is really something, a curiosity that he had on his own. And I'm going to take all these kind of bits and try to throw them together, so follow me. But if you look at his inaugural address, which he cited President McKinley, that's important, an expansionist president. And what does that mean? Because it actually means a lot if you think about the possessions that were acquired at that time and shortly before, which you're talking about. Philippines was a colony of the United States, and Hawaii and American Samoa and Guam. You're talking about, if you put it into perspective, the Panama Canal had been constructed in 1914, and the U.S. interest in Greenland dates at least from around that era. Now, again, follow me and stitch this together without giving you a history lesson. But if you look at the treaty that today governs the relationships of the U.S. and the U.S. presence in Greenland, that treaty dates from 1951. And how does that come about? I'll try to condense this as much as possible because it really has to do with today. Is that at the time, the threat, World War I and World War II, the outside threat to the region was Germany. We're trying to keep the Germans from putting a foothold. The threat at that time was Germany. Think of today, it's China, putting a foothold in Greenland. And of course, part of the problem was that Greenland belonged to Denmark, and Denmark was neutral, and they knew that wasn't going to hold. And the Brits were very concerned. It interrupts the maritime resupply. UK, especially in World War II, barely holding on, and the special relationship it had with Canada, which is a different relationship than today. Sorry, I'm giving you a history lesson. But it matters because the first interest was 1917. Something else that happened in 1917, Denmark sold the US Virgin Islands to the United States. Also had to do with, lo and behold, in 1917, the U.S. had just built the Panama Canal, and to protect the avenues of ingress, especially from German U-boats, German submarines. It's all related. So when you hear him talk about this thing, it's only one issue, and it boils down to China. And it boils down to containing China, preventing China to get their own foothold in the region, be it Greenland or Panama in any iteration. And if you could just understand his incredible appreciation for what Panama is, go back to what I said before about being a business person, and he cannot understand in what world would you, and this is part of the history Juan Carlos isn't going to like, Panama at the time was a province of Colombia. Colombia was a forgotten province of Colombia.
Some people thinking to reclaim that now.
Colombia was distracted in one of its many civil wars, and the U.S., in a wink and a nod, with this isolated province, helped them gain their independence. This isn't a secret, it's just uncomfortable. And parked 2 battleships on either side to make sure, as they were the first country to recognize Panama's independence. And part of that was a treaty to concede land and build this canal, buy the rights from the French, and pay the Panamanians money. So you can understand, the president gets all this. He says, it was an architectural feat that even today is amazing by today's standards. We just take it for granted. It was amazing. Conquered Mother Nature, the Atlantic and the Pacific, one has a tide of 16 inches and the other one of 18 feet. How do you make that happen? How do you bust through the jungle? How do you defeat yellow fever and malaria? How do you lose 3,000 American lives? So on and so forth. This is a huge achievement for the time, and I would argue still for today. And he's really proud about that. So why would you take that and what it costs you to build it, the infrastructure you have there, 9 US bases at one time, and tons of buildings and infrastructure. Panama's a country, don't take it for granted, where you can walk over the water faucet, turn it on, and drink right out of the faucet. Not too many countries in our region you can do that. US sanitation and infrastructure. So you have all this, and he's thinking, why would we give that up? We're the #1 primary user of the canal. 70% of our goods that go from the East Coast to Asia go through the canal, and 40% of the use of the canal is ours. Why would we give that up for free? That's what he's thinking, this is a terrible deal. And that what drives, and now put on top of that the Chinese operate these two, principal ports on either side of the canal. To him, it's hard to swallow. And so that's behind a lot of that. Sorry to give you a history lesson, but.
That was very important. Dan, you want to add?
Maybe just a couple of follow-on points. And one is, I think that, if Denmark should be mad at anyone, it's whoever came up with the Mercator projection. So it makes Greenland look really big on the map. If you scope it down to size, then it's around the size of the Congo. Still a big island, it's the biggest island, but I think that it does look like a big piece of strategic territory up there. And I would also add, on a more serious note, and from my time when I was at the Department of Defense, the U.S. has a really big strategic interest in the Arctic that we've been focused on in a much bigger way over the last several years. When I was at DoD, we set up an Arctic office. There's actually an Arctic Study Center to review what's happening there. Russia. If you go to the Arctic Circle, slightly over half of the landmass in the Arctic Circle is Russian territory. And the United States is there through the form of Northern Alaska, of course, but Greenland and whichever authority has the rights to Greenland is going to have a really important say in the Arctic, which is an area of greater strategic competition writ large. With regard to Panama, I think the only thing I would add is it's proving to be a really interesting case study of how the Panamanians are trying to manage this. And because President Trump has said at various junctures that we want to take back control of the canal, the Panamanians have asserted their sovereignty, but also willingness to talk. The Secretary of Defense was there this week. I know he made remarks where he said, we will seek to take back the Panama Canal, quote, from Chinese control, which is a little different than saying we will take back the Panama Canal, period, and suggest perhaps something the United States and Panama could work on together versus being in adversarial positions with respect to this. And so it's clearly, there's already been 2 cabinet level trips to Panama. Clearly this is going to remain, I think, a focus and an issue being worked at the White House and at state and DoD during administration. And where this debate actually settles, I think will be a really key proof point for how a Latin American government is managing a potentially contentious issue with the United States.
That's very important. So I think the next level of questions that are important to discuss about the region and how countries leaders are creating blocks inside the region. So let me get onto this. Populism is happening more often in Latin America, right? Are some of these populist leaders aligning in favor of an extra regional power and against the United States? Is that a perception you have? Are different levels here? So you have like the Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua bloc, and then there's a new bloc with Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, and eventually some, more social democrat perspective, that probably is somehow connected with this one, which is Chile, Uruguay, and others. That would be the first line. And also in institutions, the role of organized crime in Latin America and the connection with politics. Is that an issue you have discussed, and are you worried about it or not? looking to countries that have elections soon, like Ecuador, look very difficult. And there are some countries that have been perceived as narco states, like Venezuela or even Nicaragua. How much Colombia has moved on to that world, how much Mexico looks like that, Honduras. I mean, I think it's a very broad question, but does that have an implication on the geopolitics of the region, on the aligning of countries, and on the perception for the US? I think I will throw that to you, Dan, and maybe Juan and Olivia can give their thoughts.
Sure. I mean, there's a couple of things I would say on that. I mean, one is that the political constellations within Latin America are constantly changing. That's, I guess both the benefit and disadvantage of democratic societies. And so any bloc that you may allude to as tilting in a certain direction towards the United States or towards China at any given moment could look different a year or 2 years from now. I talked earlier about the fact that Argentina and Brazil, just to give one example, are two countries that are only briefly on the same page politically before they have been shifting back and forth. Now, China does have the Belt and Road Initiative. More than 20 countries in Latin America have agreed to join this. Although, interestingly, Panama, I think, became the first one to withdraw its membership in the context of the Panama Canal conversations. And China's always had a special advantage in its negotiations with Latin American countries, which is China has essentially the same team of negotiators that can rinse and repeat, right? A set of negotiations, whereas each Latin American government is dealing with China itself, and there has not been great knowledge sharing of experiences across the various governments for a variety of reasons. And so that's one thing that has really, I think, hampered the ability of Latin America as a region to come up with an approach to China that cannot simply be kind of undercut or adjusted as China works different deals in different countries in the region. Another point which you didn't mention, and it's not as relevant as it used to be, but I think still has some relevance for some countries, is Taiwan and the issue of Taiwan recognition. There's still several countries in Latin America that have diplomatic ties with Taiwan and not with China, notably Paraguay in South America, Guatemala, and Belize, both in Central America, and a variety of Caribbean countries. And so those are nations where Chinese diplomacy is especially relevant, both in terms of making offerings to these countries to try to get them to switch recognition, or in some cases having a more punitive approach. Just to touch the second part of your question briefly on organized crime, anytime that there's a substantial amount of illicit financing, you have to be concerned about it finding its way into politics, right? And so I think within Latin America and the Caribbean, why it's really important to have very strong protocols around money laundering, ideally campaign financing, and trying as much as possible to create a scenario where it's difficult for corrupt actors to somehow influence or insert themselves in the legitimate political systems of the countries. That's obviously easier said than done, but I think it's something that does need to have an eye kept on it.
Well, Juan, you want to speak into that?
Sure. Let me expand on a few points that Dan pointed out. And one is, I want to talk maybe about the Caribbean in that, first of all, it gets forgotten sometimes in these conversations, but it's a playground that in terms of the Chinese being able to take advantage of the fact that the United States, and this is a good time to talk about, we always talk about in very binary ways, the United States and China, but that's artificial, right? Because in our region, we should be talking about everybody's involved. And I would offer Europe and the Japanese and the Taiwanese, as Dan pointed out, and the South Koreans and so forth, because everybody has a role to play in pushing back on China. And in a place like in a place that we're discussing winners and losers, in the Caribbean, which I would offer is often cited as our third border for a lot of reasons, and we've in many ways abandoned the Caribbean, right? Started with 9/11, focused elsewhere, and who left? Well, everybody. The US, the Canadians, the Brits, the French, the Dutch, and the Caribbean has been struggling to find, sources of income. And everything they've hit on, we've hit them back on, right? So whether it was call centers or online gambling or citizenship by investment programs, all these things that had a lot of corruption involved in it and stuff, we beat them back. And they're saying, come on, you don't help us. And when we come up with ideas, you do away with them. But who's come to the rescue? The Chinese. And in this period of time, what you've seen is a proliferation of Chinese interests in the region. With a little bit of money and a little bit of effort, you can gain a lot of influence. And we've seeded that area. So you talk about groups of influence. The Caribbean is a kind of a Chinese understanding, friendly influence. And if you try to ask them, what could be done, they think in very transactional terms. Well, the Chinese built us this building as our ministry, or this airport, or whatever you want to say. Well, guess what? We're not going to build them any buildings. We're not going to build them any airports. That era is long gone. But if there's just one more thing I would add to the, we talk about Belt and Road Initiative, and listen, the Chinese economy is not doing as great as they'd like to. The days where they're handing out all this free cash is behind us. If you look at these new agreements that have been signed, and you look at the new projects that have ensued, there's no match, right? There's no congruence there. And when you do have something impressive like the Port of Chancay, which is what Dan mentioned earlier, it stands out. You know why? Because there aren't that many of those.
Very good point. You want to comment?
Sure. I mean, I'll just add one other thing I think is entirely complementary, which is this, you get to the first part of the question, Juan Carlos, as you think about what potential blocks of interest within Latin America might be. It's also helpful to think about, well, what might the economic interest of groupings be beyond just the desire to unify, for example, around a particular sort of set of political beliefs. And it's actually pretty, so if you think about Mexico and Brazil, pretty hard to see actually, I mean, what that actually is. You've got Mexico producing a lot, maybe would like some other people other than the US in some world to send that to. I don't think, for the most part, Brazil is, if anything, interested in getting its own industry going, right? Like, so Brazil's not going to be eager about having Mexico import cars to Brazil. And so it's worth thinking through in each of these cases. And part of the conundrum is going to be that you have a bunch of South American countries, as we've been talking about, whose real kind of comparative advantage right now are their natural resources and their ability to export to largely China. And so I think one real challenge, and I can say something productive about this in a second, but one real challenge for Latin America is to figure out how to create bonds that also have some form of economic interest entwined in them within the region. And I tend to believe, though I'm very curious where you all are, that without the ability to build those bonds of economic interest in addition to whatever else might hold countries together, it'll only go so far and last for so long.
That's very clear. So before we pass the word to the public for 2 or 3 questions, let me throw you 1 minute for each of you on a same question. You're meeting one of the leaders of Latin America today. Choose the country, whatever. What would you recommend them for this current geopolitical shift that we're living? That includes tariffs, that includes global power competition, and that includes, of course, the potential and opportunity for a country. How should they handle that? What would you recommend? You want to start, Juan?
Sure. I have to pick a country.
If you want, it makes the exercise more interesting. I'll give you one, Argentina.
I was going to think about Argentina. I should have thrown that one out. So this is what I think the Argentines, man, I'm going to get myself into trouble. The Argentines traditionally tend to overstate their position in Washington, I think historically, thinking that they have a lot more cards at play than they actually have. This is throughout. I'm not talking about this administration. But this administration, Milei administration, probably is doing the same. And you have to be very careful in trying to translate what is clearly an affinity on a personal level or a friendship and try to extend that in this Trump world, that means anything. Because I think in the Trump world, they don't see friends or allies or even place particular value on bilateral relations. I think that rather they had the America first and interest. So I think that it's been reflected, and there's been a lot of one-way love. The love's been well received, but there's been a lot of one-way love, but it hasn't turned into anything. And to see that Malay was just last week in Mar-a-Lago and didn't see Trump. They were supposed to be at the same event. Trump didn't show up. And, the sense I get is that, like a lot of leaders in the region, they would like to have a meeting in the Oval Office. And that goes to your question, meeting in the Oval Office. And I don't know, I think they are trying to figure out, they think they have the winning cards in their hand, but they can't seem to close a game. And there's probably a lot of reasons to that. And what I would say to someone seeking a Oval Office meeting, and this isn't so much theoretical since I did this all the time, in the first administration, I would talk to presidents and leaders in the region, and I would ask them, why? Why do you want to have a meeting with the president in the Oval Office? We would all, the response is, well, that's what we're supposed to do, right? It's protocol, we're allies. It's good for me, it's good for you. None of that plays in the Trump White House. And I would even add, because it's happened many times, that you walk in at your own risk because you have no idea what's going to take place in that meeting. And I could have prepared the president as much as I could for a meeting, and there would be something out of left field, or equally prepare the foreign president and say, hey, listen, you need to be prepared for the following. And anything can happen in that meeting. And anything will mean, and I'll close with this, in the case of Argentina, that the US is unhappy with the proximity of Argentina's relationship with China and its economic nexus, which is indispensable to, Malaysia campaigned against that relationship, but realized it's indispensable to their economic health. It's a necessary evil. I don't think the administration would look at it in the same way, and that might be a challenge.
I see. That's very clear. You want to try that, Dan? Do you want a country or do you
I'm
want
not
to
gonna
choose?
pick a country. I mean, I think it's a really important moment for national political leaders to kind of refocus on identifying, what are their core interests really, and then how can they be advanced in this period of significant kind of global disruption. And because a lot of times, kind of as Juan was saying, a lot of times what leaders may think is in their interest isn't actually in their interest. And to have a relatively narrow set of objectives and then try to move those forward, that'd be point one. Second point, and this has to do with dealing with the United States, don't try to negotiate things on Twitter or X. It's not probably going to end well for you or for the issue that you're trying to advance. And then I think also just to be able to stay cool, calm, and collected. And I think it's really difficult for a lot of leaders because if you have again, going to the U.S.-Latin America relations, if the U.S. president is saying something about you or your country or an issue publicly, there's this desire to respond publicly because it plays, and you have to manage your own national politics. But even as you're maybe solving a problem in your domestic politics, you may be creating a bigger problem in your international politics. And so figuring out a strategy to manage that, whether it's having someone who's not the president responding to the United States to be the heat shield while the leaders managing the internal politics of the country. But really, this is going to happen. The stuff we've seen in the last 3 months, it's going to happen again and again and again for 4 years, right? And so you don't want to, if you're a national leader in Latin America, you don't want to be reinventing the wheel every time, but to kind of have a formula and say, oh yes, I know what we do when this happens, and then to roll out a strategy that makes sense to the moment.
Olivia, you want a country Or
I do not want to.
All right.
No, but also maybe Johnny, one note a little bit here, but with what I know best, keep your eye on your long-term economic interest, and that requires the sort of investment that's going to grow your productivity. And you know the sort of industries that you need to start to bring in, and you know the sorts of industries where you probably are already overweight and you cannot continue to get overweight. And unless you are able to continue to focus on those areas and read the environment that will foster investment, maybe none of this other stuff really matters for the long-term success of your country.
So on that line, one thing that I've been doing recently is precisely looking at countries in different places of the world that can give lessons for Latin America. Let's say Finland, Singapore, Australia, South Korea, and even the Emirates these days. What can we get from them that allows us to create specific policies and advance in human capital or planning or infrastructure or use of natural resources to empower communities and create economic growth. Just, out of thinking from what you said, but at the same time, understanding that the world is changing. And as the two of you said, you have to understand your game and know what are your interests and what you're doing. So this has been a great conversation. I really enjoy it. I will pass the word. I think we have maybe space for 2 questions, maybe 3, but I recommend you make it, and then here are the microphones in front, and then we give a final response. That will be the best way. So you want to start? Eduardo, please. You want to come? If you want to come here. There's a student there. You want to come? Students first. If you're not a student, Eduardo, you get it first. You get it second.
Then I'll start.
Here's a student. Come here. Yeah, come. She's your student. There's a lot of
pick
people.
a student, I'll pick a student.
There's a lot of people watching us also in stream, so just for you to know and remind us all.
So thank you for being here, for having this conversation. One of the things that was mentioned a few times today was the importance of natural resources. And we've seen how natural resources discovery can shift your political interest quickly. In Guyana, which is a small country between Brazil and Venezuela, they're experiencing a boom with the discovery of oil, 650,000 barrels per day. My question is, what lessons can smaller countries like Guyana learn from other Latin American countries in terms of managing international alliances?
Great. Eduardo, you want to?
Yeah, I was going to say, I was a little taken aback by some of thank you so much for being here. Princeton and Juan Carlos always is our leader here for Latin America. So thank you so much, Juan Carlos, for putting this together. My name is Eduardo Batia. I'm from Puerto Rico. I'm also a visiting professor here. My question, I guess, is sum up with just one question. What if Donald Trump is wrong in terms of this view of the world just adjusting to what the U.S. wants? The world may just decide to adjust to something else. And basically right now, what you need for technology, for AI, for everything that will come in the future, you need minerals, you need people, you need support. Everything the U.S. is doing goes against what the world will need in the next 50 years to grow, right? And the minerals are not in the United States. They are in Panama, where the goodwill of the United States is going out the window right now. They are in Latin America. They're in Africa, where the goodwill of the United States is just going completely out the drain because the United States behavior, this Monroe Doctrine, 3.0, I guess now, is just not well perceived anywhere else but in some circles in the United States. So my question is, what if the view of Donald Trump is simply, and I guess one is for you, is simply hurting the United States everywhere and sort of taking away decades of goodwill being built throughout the world?
Thank you, Eduardo. You want to make the last question? Thanks.
So first of all, thank you very much for the information you shared. I'm a Turkish-American businessman who does business in defense and e-commerce. So my question is actually to you, Mr. Professor De Carlos. I mean, I understand the view of United States on these issues, but also I would like to know your views that you are coming from the field and you know the field, you did many things in your country in a good way. So that's why I would like to know the local person's perspective in the issues that we just discussed, like US-China relationship or the influence of these countries, because there's a potential to become a battlefield for these countries, that's why, if you can share some, advices or, your opinions, that will be very helpful for us. Because I'm looking for the business opportunities in Latin America, and now I'm very concerned, how to approach, because I used to live in China. I did my bachelor in China, but now in the US, and now very concerned, how should I approach to the countries,
Very well. So I will pass the word first to you if you want to answer any of the questions about Guyana, about policy being wrong right now, or a vision from the region.
I cede my time to Dan.
So Dan's yours.
Okay.
I was joking. If it,
No, no, but I will go and then let you jump in. So on Guyana, great question. It's really fascinating what's happening there, from going to basically a highly indebted poor country to a country that's had double-digit GDP growth for the past several years going into the future. I think that the Guyanese have had the advantage of being able to consult widely on their energy exploration, looking for lessons both in Latin America, but also in the Middle East and other states, and really trying to avoid Dutch disease, which is the negative economic impact that can come from a very sudden find of resources. One thing that is clear that Guyana is going to need additional human capital, both to manage the actual energy extraction, but then also all the subsidiary industries that develop around this to support not just the energy, but even, I mean, I was in Guyana recently, new hotels and new infrastructure and so forth. And so it could be a case where leaning on the diaspora and finding ways for most Guyanese don't actually live in Guyana. They live in the US, UK, Canada, et cetera, and finding pathways to bring back real talent in a variety of different fields would be really critical as well. And I guess to the professor's question, I think it's very relevant. I went to, full disclosure, I didn't go to Princeton.
Your wife did, which
I
is
went
more
to
important.
the Kennedy School, and so I'm kind of a disciple of Joseph Nye and soft power,
Yeah.
and the impact that soft power can have to obtain results or get to a better place, maybe to put it more colloquially, in international relations that isn't just fully coercive and using different types of hard power. And I'm extremely concerned that soft power that we have developed over decades is being washed away really without a thought. I mean, you could think of the U.S. Agency for International Development as one entity, but there are many others that we could look at. And if President Trump is successful, does success through hard power somehow generate a different type of soft power along with it? I don't know. That wasn't really clear in the first term, and now it seems like the U.S. is going a lot further down this path. So I think that's a real, a real risk, and frankly one that's been kind of understudied and not fully evaluated, because as whether it's international relations or human relations, one way that you get other stakeholders to do what you would like them to do is convince them that it's in their own interest and that's a good idea. And it's not all coercive in nature. But that's just my prologue to Juan, who's going to give the actual real answer to that question. And then I acknowledge the other questioner about wanting a perspective from I guess from you. And he should get one because you're, this is your panel.
No, no, no. No, I have only a line on that, and to be fair, I think it's important to listen the closing remark of Juan and Olivia. But from my side, what I'm suggesting in a country like mine, and in the countries in the region, is don't fall in the trap of feeling that you can play a game that you're not invited to play. We need to focus on the opportunities for our people. We need to continue to focus on creating and solving problems that are there. We have structural problems on institutions, on economics, on infrastructure, on public services, on healthcare. So why are we, our leaders trying to play global roles and playing as international ideologies and try to move agendas that honestly are not going to bring prosperity to our countries, and by the way, are going to get our countries into trouble. So my approach is we need a lot of pragmatism and a lot of practicality, and be very strong on looking for a long-term vision and really move onto that agenda. Because that's where Latin American countries, certainly mine, can become good for our people, which is the number one thing, but then somehow powerful to the future as we progress. But if we fall into the trap, we're going to get smashed. Nobody likes to be in a game of elephants, especially when you are mice. You don't need to. You one day can be an elephant. And yes, we can, but it's not our time. We get it. We better get to that place at the right time. Juan, you want to make your closing remark, and we'll ask you, Olivia, as well?
Sure. So, presidents are wrong all the time. He wouldn't be the first president to be wrong. And I didn't come here to defend Trump. I came here to explain what he's doing and to help people understand where he's coming from on these issues. And what I would say is, if there's anything that we've seen, is that we have gotten it wrong about Trump since 2016, when he was one of 13 people on stage and nobody gave him chances or serious credibility. So who knows if we'll be wrong one more time. But clearly somebody thinks this is the right way to go. And as Dan indicates, things like USAID and soft power, where I would argue we need it more now than ever, but we weren't doing it. You might not like the way Trump does things, but it's not entirely crazy. I spent 30 years in operating overseas. I had the opportunity to be on the ground, then be a manager in Washington and do policy at the White House. That's the whole gamut. You get to see it all from all different directions, not just the pedestal that they put you on. And I can tell you that we've gotten it wrong many times in many policies across many presidents. And that's part of the reason we're in the situation we are now. But I can also say that my colleagues 40 years ago that I was elbow to elbow in the most remote areas of Latin America that needed the presence of AID, that AID hasn't existed for a long time. And if there's you want the ultimate evaluation of AID, I would direct you to the last two cigar reports, the special IG on Afghanistan, and read all the things that were done incorrectly. And when you're an agency that gets to correct its own homework, that narrative takes any direction you want it to take. And as a developmental agency, the number one way you should grade yourself is on not existing anymore. Because what you set yourself up to do, you've been successful at. But I challenge you to find one place that we ever closed an AID office. All they did was transition to some other self-licking lollipop. And why do we have an 8-9-story AID building in Cairo and unending programs? And now we've gotten a glimpse into all the programs that I would suggest on that list, there's at least one that you disagree with. So I don't agree with doing away with AID. I think it was a Cold War structure that was designed. It's our best instrument of soft power, but it wasn't doing its job, and there was a lot of. I don't agree with the way it was done, but I understand why it was done. And so some things is going to get right, some things is going to get wrong, but ultimately they think they're on the right track. We'll all see, right? Ultimately. And on Guyana, I'll say you're probably privileged because the two of us are some of the very few U.S. officials who've been to Guyana.
I'm sure you know.
I know, I first went to Guyana, my first trip in the U.S. government in 1985. wide-eyed and bushy-tailed. And then I went, during the Biden administration, I was a senior advisor for the Secretary General of the OAS. And during the election mishaps and confusion, I was sent down to talk to the president of Guyana and the parties and so on and so forth. And if there's one thing I point out is that the Guyanese have done too many things correctly. They really are on track, even in the past administration, but they're doing a lot of solid things to be able to avoid the pitfalls of being one of those countries that receives new enormous amounts of resources and then squanders it. They're doing a lot of good things and the right way. And I agree with Dan, but number one thing you need is infrastructure, because infrastructure in Guyana, almost all of it is insufficient. I think the last time I stayed in Guyana at the only hotel, well, there are two, but the Marriott, it was like $1,300 a night, and that's not a $1,300 a night hotel. What I would say, even that they're cautious because there's been this never-ending line of people selling snake oil in Guyana, and the Guyanese haven't bought it. So I think it's awesome. And hats off to the Biden administration, which in a one-year period, anybody who was anybody went to Guyana. Our ambassador to the UN, our head of the CIA, Dan went a couple of times. Everybody went to Guyana. I would offer more visits of senior US officials than any other country in the hemisphere. And that's important because what Guyana is and where it was it needed that kind of attention. So, yeah.
Slating the panel, it's almost to end, but I will just throw a line about Guyana. The concern that I think some people is starting to have about Guyana is a potential of international crisis there, or conflict, caused mainly by the Maduro regime for whatever the purpose, and eventually, not very taken seriously by other players in the region. I'm just saying it's a potential crisis there,
But even that Guyana has done well because it could have gone crazy and gone on a wild shopping spree. Hasn't done that. It's been very calculated. Its purchases. I love the fact that they, at first, if you look at the inventory, Guyana doesn't have a strong defense force. It's not a lot of people, and they've got most of their equipment is from the old Soviet Union, and it's kind of stitched and stapled together. But guess what? They're on a very firm footing to get, professionalized, and even their purchases are well thought out. The latest aircraft they bought from India will give them a lift and reach into remote areas of Guyana.
Well, you have to close these panels, so you have your minute. Thank you so much, Olivia. But you hasn't finished. Let's get your final.
Any better than that?
Say is we've been for the past 5 years at least transitioning into an era that's very different from the 20 years or 30 years that preceded. I think there's absolutely no question about that. I wouldn't see what's happening right now as isolated in that transformation, even though it may well be sort of both decisive but also indicative. Huge amount of uncertainty in where we're actually going to go. So no bets on who's right, who's wrong, or even sort of how everything happens as an interacting whole across the globe. Do remember, as you're thinking about these things, to remember to look at the economics behind everything and the economic interests as well. I don't just sell things to people or I don't just buy things from people because I feel goodwill towards them or vice versa. Important to remember that. And I mean, there are a lot of different ways that this could go, but then let me just truly close by saying that I think what Juan Carlos said is critically most important for Latin America, which is that without a longer term economic vision, none of the rest of this shorter term conversation, as tumultuous and as high stakes as it may be, is actually going to matter all that much.
Thank you so much. What a great panel. Thank you for coming.